Hi. Good.
Is that a Talbot?
Pardon me? No, no. It's the cathedral in New Orleans. Yeah.
That guy was there. He was there. Here's the one we went through with him, his trucks are on there. You walk down the river. Now, you know, you see this 3 or 4 trucks, and it's living in a house right there. So they live in the neighborhood, so it's pretty. The last guy, was still looking for one. He's right around the house.
Never.
Yeah.
Yeah, baptism by fire, huh? Oh my goodness.
Well, you know, like my life is just like when it rains and pours, so what if it does snow? Well,
Here's one.
Just smash the seats.
Walk up to the channel.
What was that for?
Yeah, it's been fun. I think we're gonna hear from Craig today. Yeah. Doing his, we're anticipating a riveting.
Oh, it's
Riveting.
thrilling stuff,
Yes,
and,
you know.
I mean, it won't take very long at all. and-
Lawyer's jokes and all that.
Oh, yeah,
Oh, good,
absolutely.
okay.
I'll really spice it up a little bit.
You wanna make it interesting?
I don't promise that.
You were gonna do that. Before, you know, this death by PowerPoint. So you're not gonna do it first, so I can get out of here? No, I'm gonna switch to.
Good, yeah.
hallway?
Yeah, yeah.
You don't mind, do you? Not at all. I don't want to miss out on the apartment comment. Yeah. That's the whole point, right? But I don't want to wait for the. Yes. Stuff to go through before you. Always enjoy the out the basic. It's always fun.
He's not here?
Oh, no, he's normally, he's got time. He's just finishing his cocktail.
6 more minutes.
Is there a clicker for the slides? Or do I tell somebody to change them?
Randy, let me ask Randy. Randy usually forwards those.
Oh, okay.
Let me check.
You never know. Our project got signed off.
Oh, slide clicker? I don't have one.
I remember hearing about it.
Oh, yeah, Maverick Day.
That was so much fun.
I watched it afterwards, so just to see what.
She was great.
Yeah. There's no clicker, but Randy can advance the slides.
Okay.
Laser.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting of Solvang City Council, regular meeting, calling to order at 6:30. Please read the roll call.
Councilmember Infante,
Here.
Councilmember Smith,
Here.
Councilmember Elizabeth Arona, absent. Councilmember Claudia Arona,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Brown.
Here.
Excuse me, Mayor Brown.
I know who I am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And then I'd like if Bridget Paris would lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to make a quick adjustment to our agenda tonight. The presentation by our attorney for the Brown Act training and Levine Act, we're going to move back or rotate that. We want public comments first so we don't have to endanger our public, those that want to make a comment, and death by PowerPoint. So we're going to rearrange that and go from there. So I have no slips. Is there anybody that wants to make public comment or anybody online? Mr. Murphy.
I don't have a public comment, but I want to take this opportunity to introduce Bridget Paris. She just led the pledge. She started today as our new Public Works Director. So welcome, Bridget.
Welcome aboard.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I worked for the city of Solvang a while back. Actually, when I started in 2014, my two boys were like this tall, and now I'm back and they're this tall and this tall. So I look forward to serving the community. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Great to have you back.
Okay. No public comment? We'll move on to item 3, which is our presentation. There are no proclamations either, so we'll have presentations by our city attorney.
Thank you. I think I'll try this chair so I can see the whole dais as much as possible. Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. Appreciate the opportunity to present and hopefully not commit death by PowerPoint. This presentation this evening on basically this sort of range of transparency laws that apply to city council members in your interactions with staff and with the public. It's important to note that a few years back, about 6 years ago to be exact, the voters adopted an amendment to the state constitution, and the text of that amendment is before you here, and they, through an initiative measure, adopted a state constitutional provision that says the right of access to information concerning the conduct of the people's business, and therefore the meetings of public bodies and the writings of public officials and agencies shall be open to public scrutiny. So we went from what had been most of my early career statutory law that you obviously wanted to comply with, but was really at the level of statutory compliance, and took it to the voters making this access to public information and public meetings to be a constitutional right. And, you know, when lawyers see something that's a constitutional right, it takes it up a step, right? Because if we deny that access, if we do not allow folks to get access to public writings or to properly attend and participate in public meetings, now we're violating a state constitutional right, and it becomes just frankly a more serious issue. And so between the adoption of this provision and then AB 1234 that you're all familiar with that requires an ethics training component every couple of years, there's been a much greater emphasis on these types of presentations, this type of training. I personally, after 33 years or more in government, think it's a good thing to have these sessions publicly, even though it takes up the council's time and obviously the public's time. I think it's a good thing because it's a way to signal cultural values. It's a way to show your constituents that these concepts are important culturally in the city. And it's a way, I think, when residents have a view that, yeah, transparency is part of the culture of the city of Solvang, they have more confidence in the decisions that are being made by the city of Solvang. So I think there's a benefit to having these trainings, and I'm pleased to be able to present this to you this evening. Oops, went twice. There we go. So I'm going to talk about 5 basic subjects, and I'm going to kind of fly through a lot of these slides to condense things and try not to take up too much of your time. We're going to talk about the Brown Act, which is obviously the open meeting law, the Political Reform Act, and talk about conflicts of interest that arise both from financial interests and now, as you know, from the Levine Act. They also arise out of campaign contributions, and so we'll talk about those issues as well as gifts and perks that might come about as a consequence of you being a public official. We'll touch quickly on the Public Records Act, and as I say, the Levine Act is included within my conflict of interest discussion, and then just a couple of slides about due process to remind everybody about the concepts of due process rights and making decisions free from bias. The Brown Act has 3 purposes: public participation in the decision-making process, promoting that and protecting it, allowing the public to have oversight of the decision-making process, and protecting public agencies' legitimate confidentiality interests. I kind of liken the purposes of the Brown Act to the old sausage-making analogy, which is that if people who have business before the city or observe the business of the city get to see how decisions get made and get to participate in the making of the decision and realize that there's a process that goes on to making that decision, they're going to have a lot more confidence in the decision, whether they agree with it or not, because they got to see it being made. The same as folks would eat the sausage if they got to see it being made instead of wondering what was in it. So the old days of kind of smoke-filled back rooms that were the stereotypical kind of boss tweed type of government never led to confidence in government because people didn't know how decisions were being made. They just knew that they were being made somewhere back there. And so, transparency in my mind leads to a significant increase in public confidence in the decisions of the agency. Here's the main gist of the Brown Act. All meetings of the legislative body of a local agency shall be open and public. All persons shall be permitted to attend any meeting of the legislative body of a local agency, except as otherwise provided in this chapter. That's kind of the whole Brown Act in one paragraph. And so we talk about what's a legislative body, what's a meeting, what does open and public mean, how do people participate, and what are the permitted exceptions to those rules. Legislative body, I think you all know this. Obviously, the City Council is the legislative body for the City of Solvang. It's the governing body of the local agency, is the primary thing in a definition of a legislative body. But it's also your subordinate boards and commissions, like your Planning Commission. That legislative body also has to comply with the Brown Act, as well as other formal commissions that have been created by the City Council. And some cities have standing committees. They will have the Budget and Finance Committee or the Personnel Committee or the Fire Commission or the Police Commission. And those kind of formal commissions are also covered by the Brown Act rules. On the other hand, advisory committees, what we usually call ad hoc committees, are not covered by the Brown Act because they're limited. They're appointed sort of informally, either by the city manager, maybe by the mayor. They're sent off to do some investigation and save some time and legwork for the rest of the council on a limited issue for a limited time and then come back and report. And when they come back and report, that's a Brown Act meeting, right? They share their information in an open forum. So I think the Brown Act considers it to be okay that they had non-open meetings in the course of acting as that ad hoc committee. What the Brown Act doesn't allow is to have an ad hoc committee that just lasts forever, right? It has to really be a limited purpose and a limited time in order to qualify for the exception and not have to comply with all the rules we're going to talk about for legislative bodies. All right, so we know what a legislative body is. What's a meeting? There are four elements to that. A majority of the members of a body getting together at the same time and location, and that includes via technology, to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of that body. I think the last two are kind of the most important concepts to talk about, because a lot of people I find think that the Brown Act only applies to voting. It's only a problem if you vote in secret. And that's not true. What the statute says is that if a majority of the members of the body get together at the same time and place to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item, then the Brown Act covers that meeting. So it's much more than just voting. And also, I think the limitation is it has to be within the subject matter jurisdiction of the city council. So all four of you could go to a coffee shop tomorrow and sit around and talk about the weather, your grandchildren, your food, the Dodgers, whatever you wanted to talk about that wasn't city business, and that would not violate the Brown Act. It only violates the Brown Act if the discussion goes into items that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the city council, which is everything in the city, right? So people look at that meeting, if they saw you sitting outside of the coffee shop, they'd go, well, look at them, they're making a deal, whatever. It would be the cynic's kind of description of it. But I know of social events, for example, where the entire city council has been present, and literally I was sitting at the table and know that we didn't talk about business the entire night, because you're cognizant of this rule, that you can't have discussions that are within the subject matter jurisdiction, but you can have discussions that are just normal human interactions, right? You can talk about each other's lives and not violate the Brown Act. Still, the public perception is always an issue. I think it's easier, obviously, to be a planning commissioner, for example, because the subject matter jurisdiction of the planning commission is really narrow. So they could all get together and talk about, we ought to have more pickleball in the city or something. That's a Parks and Recreation issue that they have no jurisdiction over on the Planning Commission, and that's not a problem either because their jurisdiction is so narrow. You are all elected to make all the decisions and talk about everything that is city business, and so your jurisdiction is much broader, and it's a little harder to stay out of a Brown Act issue. Serial meetings are illegal. My example a minute ago was that you were all sitting having coffee someplace. A serial meeting is where you're still having a discussion of some kind about a subject matter within your jurisdiction, but you might not all be physically in the same place. You might have a serial meeting, for example, through what we call a hub and spoke situation where, let's say, the city manager has a matter he wants to talk to council members about, and he starts picking up the phone, and he calls the mayor and says, there's this issue coming up, here's the deal, this is the decision you're going to have to make, this is what we think the recommendation is going to be. Mayor says, okay, I'm on board, yes, I support that. What the city manager cannot do is then call a second council member and say, hey, I just talked to the mayor's on board, can we get you on board? Because that's sharing information and sharing the mayor's position on an issue with another member of the city council. The violation occurs if the mayor calls if the city manager calls two more council members and says, look, if we can just line up the two of you with the mayor, we're good to go. That's a violation of the Brown Act because the city manager was at the hub and shared information back and forth with council members at the spoke. Now, you all know that one-to-one interactions happen all the time. Briefings with you and the city manager happen all the time. That's okay. That's specifically allowed by the Brown Act. What the city manager cannot do in the course of those briefings is do what I just gave the example of. Can't have a meeting with one of you And then the next one comes in and say, well, this council member is on board. What do you think? It's really got to be a one-to-one briefing, answering questions, talking about issues, taking in ideas, but not sharing the positions of other council members. Another way this happens is what we call a chain meeting, which is where one of you will email or call another one and say, this is what I'm thinking about doing. And the person who got that email or call then emails or calls a third council member and says, this is what council member A is thinking about doing. I agree. What do you think? And it's one to one to one to one, but it's still a chain, and a majority of the city council getting together to discuss an item of public business and developing sort of a collective concurrence as they go through that chain. Now, as my experience lately, what happens more frequently is a completely well-intended and unintentional chain meeting, which is caused by one of the most nefarious inventions ever known to man, which is the reply all function on the email products that we use. I wish that button did not exist, because y'all get these emails where there might be 75 people on the email list, and you don't read all 75, and you don't notice that the other members of the city council are in this email chain, and you get something and you see that it's wrong, or you disagree, or whatever reason you want to reply, and as soon as you reply and you hit reply all and your colleagues are on that list, well, you've committed a Brown Act violation because you've engaged in one of these chain email situations that did not occur in an open meeting like this one. So we always caution about the possibility of unintentionally committing a serial meeting violation through kind of digital communications. And that could be group emails, group texts. It could be comment sections on an article that you happen to read or somebody else's post. And it really could be through social media. And all of those situations are inadvertent violations, but the people who are out there looking for violations and looking for reasons to criticize will find those. So I'll have some advice about social media in a slide or two. So the takeaways from this serial meeting concept are: avoid discussing city business with more than one other member outside a public meeting. A communication with one other member is okay. A communication with two other members, either together or through this chain concept, is not okay. Avoid soliciting or communicating the view of another member of the city council outside a public meeting. It's just better to have that interaction in a public meeting, and avoid interacting with the other members of the city council on various social media sites. Our tips here are that you should not communicate your position on a pending matter to a majority of the members, and you should not solicit responses from other members when forwarding the information you receive. Again, asking for somebody's opinion is just as bad as giving somebody your opinion. It just creates a situation where the Brown Act could be violated. And again, avoid the dreaded reply all function. You'll notice that sometimes from our office especially, the city council will get an email that's a confidential attorney-client privilege, and it'll be sent to the council by BCC. And we do that as a practice at the firm, and I know staff sometimes does the same thing because it doesn't allow replies. You can only reply to the person who sent it to you. So we'll send you legal advice, which we're entitled to do under the attorney-client rules. We're entitled to send that outside of a meeting if it's confidential. And then we only get a response directly from one council member, and each of you doesn't see the responses. So I think sending things to an entire body by BCC is a really good practice because it avoids the reply all problem. And there's the BCC recommendation. And again, deliberations, the intent of the law is that deliberations occur publicly in a meeting and not by text or in social media or out in the hallway before the meeting starts. Somebody younger than me made this presentation, and so I'm not sure who that is, but I'm sure there's an age threshold at which that character is recognized. Okay, internet social media platforms. This is one of the newest amendments to the Brown Act that came about 2 or 3 years ago. Basically, Government Code Section 54952.2 now says that you cannot make, post, or share comments between members of a legislative body that are, and that would include emojis and other digital icons that express reactions to communications made by other members of the legislative body. Significantly, this applies to 2 members of the legislative body, not a majority. So if a member of the city council posts something on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, another member of the city council cannot even like that post if it refers to city business. So here's what I'm thinking about doing on this new development project, and here's why. As another city council member cannot respond to that at all, even through just a like or dislike or whatever, under this statute. That's now a Brown Act violation. So I really advise members of legislative bodies to not react at all to social media posts from their colleagues unless it's a picture of food or somebody's cat. That's fine. It's the same thing as my coffee example. It's fine to like a picture of somebody's grandkids or somebody's pet or whatever meal they're eating. That doesn't have anything to do with city business. It's the posts that relate to city business that you really have to be careful with. Now, it's okay for members on social media to answer questions from the public. Somebody comes on your page and says, what do you think about this? It's okay for you individually to answer that question back on social media. It's okay to provide information to the public. Everybody has a kind of an official city council social media presence now, almost everybody, where you tell people about community events, you tell people to come down to a festival or whatever's going on. That's absolutely okay. We're just asking, and the law is now requiring that you not react when one of your colleagues makes those posts. It's also okay to, on social media, ask the public to tell you what they think. If that's the way you interact on social media and you say, this is an issue that's come up, tell me what you think about this. Should we widen the road or whatever? It's okay to ask for that information as an individual public official. It's not okay for your colleagues to answer the question or for you to answer somebody else's question. There are rules for teleconferences. I'm sure most of you have experienced those now. There's basically 3 situations. There was always this kind of traditional rule where somebody was just out of town. Councilmember Arona, I'm surprised, is not calling in from Barcelona tonight, but there is an allowance in the Brown Act. If somebody is willing to post the agenda where they are and note on the agenda where the location where they'll be participating, then participation through teleconference is okay. Many people, for obvious reasons, don't want to do that, and it's just better to skip a meeting. But I have had clients on vacation or at a conference or whatever in some hotel. They had to ask the hotel to post the agenda, out at the front door, and they had to make their hotel room public, which I think is kind of crazy, but that's what they did in order to participate in a meeting. So the Brown Act allows that, and we can help with those rules, and the city clerk as well. There's 2 other now newer post-COVID teleconference abilities. One is for what's called just cause or emergency, which is basically if there's a declared emergency or some emergency circumstances. I just had a meeting last week where a board member had to stay home with her elderly parent who had just had surgery and was the caregiver. That's allowable under this justification as long as the rest of a quorum of the legislative body is actually here in the council chambers while that meeting's going on. The other one is imminent risk to health and safety of attendees. In the event of proclaimed emergency, this is the one we used during COVID a lot to have Zoom meetings where there was a proclaimed emergency for COVID. In LA County, just during the fires in January, proclaimed emergency, the LA City Council and other jurisdictions met by Zoom under this imminent risk exception. So if that comes up, we know how to handle that, and we'll work with the city clerk to schedule those and agendize those Zoom meetings. Sometimes what looks like a meeting is not a meeting under the Brown Act, and these are a few examples of that. As I told you, individual contacts, your individual briefings with the city manager, for example, or with other members of the staff, individually meeting, not sharing information, that's not a meeting under the Brown Act. You can all attend conferences and seminars. You go to the League of Cities, you go to any different kind of conference and seminar that is not being used as an excuse to do public business behind the scenes. So if there's a seminar on a subject you all want to attend, and you all go and attend and don't use it as kind of a pseudo city council meeting by standing off in the corner talking about something, that's perfectly okay. Community meetings that are open and publicized, if there's an HOA meeting, Chamber of Commerce, breakfast, any of those kinds of things that are open to other people and publicized, y'all can attend those without worrying about Brown Act issues. You can attend another body of the agency. Members of the city council could go to the planning commission meeting, could go to the DRC. As long as they're open and noticed meetings of that body, we encourage you to not participate for example, if you wanted to attend a planning commission meeting, because it tends to kind of dirty the record up a little bit and create charges that you're trying to intimidate or guide the decision of another body. But you are entitled to attend without worrying about Brown Act issues, as long as that meeting is open and public. Social ceremonial events, the Little League opening day, the ribbon cutting of the business downtown, things you all go to all the time. Again, as long as you're not using it as a way to hide a city council meeting from the public. Ad hoc committee meetings, we talked about ad hoc committees a minute ago, and observation but not participation in a standing committee. So if the council had a audit committee, for example, and 2 members were on the standing audit committee, a third could go and observe but not participate and avoid violating the Brown Act. So a regular meeting is what we're at tonight. There are three types. I'm going to talk about them just quickly each. A regular meeting is the one that's established by resolution or ordinance that says we're going to meet the second and fourth Monday or the first and third Tuesday or whatever it is, a certain time. And the expectation is that there will be a meeting every one of those dates. It's established by resolution or ordinance. The agenda has to be posted 72 hours in advance, and it must contain a general brief description of items of business. Then there's what's called a special meeting, which is called by the presiding officer or a majority of the city council. And the unique thing about a special meeting is that it can be called on only 24 hours notice. And that's a situation where either there's a workshop, single subject kind of workshop, we need to talk about this, we're going to give 24 hours notice, or some sort of emergency situation. But there is a possibility to have meetings on 24 hours notice, as long as that notice states the time, place, and the agenda for what's going to occur at the special meeting. The limitation is all you can talk about is the item or items that are listed on the agenda. You can't add items to the agenda. The public doesn't get to talk about items that are on some different subject. They can only talk about the item that's on the special meeting. So there's a limitation, and there's some certain things you can't do at a special meeting, but meetings can be held on 24 hours notice. Then there's also, I don't have a slide on this, but there's, just so you know, there's also an emergency meeting, which is a meeting that could occur under very specific emergency circumstances with only 1 hour notice. It's for a terrorist attack or a large fire or something. where something needs to happen with only an hour's notice. I've been doing this over 30 years. I've never seen an emergency meeting. There is a provision in the Brown Act for it. Agenda requirements, once they're posted, they have to be publicly accessible, and this is for either a special or a regular meeting, and distributed in advance to those who request copies. Bless you. There's typically a list in the city clerk's office of media members, organizations, individuals who request copies of agendas, and so they have to be sent to those folks. The agenda also must be posted on the agency's website, and the teleconference information, if any, has to be included on the posted agenda. And if an item is not on the posted agenda, then there cannot be discussion or action on those items. That's an absolute rule for special meetings. The limited exception for regular meeting, as some of you may know, is that you can add an item to an agenda in certain circumstances for a regular meeting. I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you're at a special meeting, you talk about the item that's on the agenda and nothing else, and items cannot be added to special meeting agendas. At a regular meeting, if something has come up, it is possible to add it to an agenda. There are 3 requirements for that. The item has to have come to the agency's attention after the agenda was posted. There is an immediate need to take action before the next meeting, and there's a 2/3 vote required to add that to the agenda. So all 3 of those items have to be satisfied to add something if it's not on a posted agenda. A common example would be somebody discovers after the agenda is posted that there's going to be a vote in the legislature on a bill that is particularly important to the city of Solvang, and it's going to occur before your next meeting. So it's going to occur between 2 meetings. And if you wait till the next meeting, the vote will have been taken and your legislator won't know the city's opinion on a bill. If you add it to the agenda under those circumstances because it came to the city's attention after the agenda was posted, and there's a need to take action before your next regular meeting, well, then you can add it with a 2/3 vote. You can give direction to your staff and send the letter. That's the common kind of example for this, but it really has to have come to the agency's attention after the agenda was posted. It's not a situation where a staff report was sitting on somebody's desk and they just didn't get it done before the deadline, but they got done on Friday after they posted was Thursday, and can't we please add it to the agenda? That doesn't qualify because the agency already knew about it at the time the agenda was posted. Now, some things that do not appear on an agenda, you can still talk about. These are the kind of 6 exceptions. You can make a brief response to comments from members of the public. Somebody says, hey, I want to know how I get the pothole in front of my house filled. The mayor can say, there's the public works director sitting in the second row. Why don't you talk to her and see what can be done about that project, right? That's a brief response telling people how to solve a problem. That's allowed without being on the agenda. Questions for clarification or a referral to staff. Again, somebody says something in public comment. It's a question. One of you wants to help answer that question. You could ask the city manager, hey, how do we get that information? That's perfectly fine, even though it doesn't appear on an agenda. Each of you can make a brief announcement or a report on your activities, which is generally the kind of thing y'all do in these meetings anyway. You can make a request for a future report. You can ask the city manager to have a report prepared on a particular subject. You can even, under the council's bylaw rules, agree to place an item on a future agenda. And that could include a discussion about whether or not you all agree that it should be on a future agenda, right? A council member could say, I would like to have something on an agenda, and like my colleague's concurrence, you could have a discussion about whether or not you want that issue to be discussed at the city council. Very limited, only are we going to talk about this at a future meeting. That discussion is okay to determine whether to give direction to the city manager. Again, if this emergency situation exists that I've told you I've never I've never come across, if the fire is burning up and you want to declare a local emergency, for example, that can happen at a meeting without the, excuse me, without being posted on the agenda. Public participation, the public has a right to speak at every meeting on any matter within the subject jurisdiction of your city council, and that's at regular meetings only, or the specific item of business on the special, either on a special meeting agenda or like tonight on your individual agenda items. Public agencies are not permitted to prohibit public criticism of the agency or the legislative body. So if somebody wants to stand up at the podium and say that the city attorney is incompetent and doesn't know what he's doing, and by the way, he's a crook, and whatever they want to say about me, if it's being said from the podium in the meeting, we can't prohibit that. We can't prohibit criticism of the city and how the city handled an issue or is handling an issue. People are allowed to come to the podium within the rules and say what they think. Increasingly, there's been opinions that we can restrict folks from criticizing individual staff members in a way that is harassing or threatening. And that's a kind of a developing area of law now where we have to protect our employees from harassment, from intimidation, from threats. And so we are increasingly, and unfortunately I haven't seen this here, but in a situation where the duty to protect employees from, as required by law, from language and accusations that would be considered threatening or harassing outweighs the public's right to say stuff. So that's an additional kind of developing area. And then reasonable regulations of the public comments, kind of guardrails around them, are allowed. And you have these. Time limits, asking folks to fill out speaker cards, rules of decorum, asking them to speak only from the podium and not yell from the back of the room, or only talk on when they're called on, address the mayor instead of the rest of the audience. Those kinds of things are permitted and have been sanctioned by both federal and state courts. One thing you should know is that the public has to be allowed to record a meeting if they want to, and I've seen it at meetings of this council every once in a while, somebody with a camera who's recording. They just can't disrupt the meeting. They can't come up and sort of try to record over your shoulder or something from the dais. They can just stand in a place that's not disruptive and record the meeting. Enforcement of the Brown Act, there's two ways that the Brown Act can get enforced. One is a civil lawsuit that would try to invalidate a decision or an action that's taken in violation of the Brown Act. This is the most frequent way Brown Act enforcement issues come up. But in this case, the first thing that has to happen is that the person who alleges the Brown Act violation has to give notice and what's called an opportunity to cure, which is better known as a do-over. If a person believes that the Brown Act has been violated, they weren't allowed to comment on something, a vote was taken without public input, whatever the alleged violation is, they have to give notice and a certain period of time to allow us to cure the violation before it goes forward into a lawsuit. Sometimes somebody will say, I know you had a closed session and you made a decision and you didn't announce it at the end of the closed session. I want you to cure that. Or you shouldn't have been discussing that in closed session. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes the public agency will go, yep, you know what, we forgot to make that announcement, or in the benefit of hindsight, that wasn't a proper closed session discussion, we're going to cure that and have that discussion in open session. So there's a way to avoid a lawsuit if, in fact, a mistake has been made. But most often, we don't believe that the Brown Act has been violated. Somebody else does. They file a lawsuit and litigate over it. And unfortunately, public agencies almost always lose Brown Act and Public Records Act lawsuits just because judges, not just because, but for one reason is judges view that state constitutional privilege and they say, I got to interpret everything in a way that promotes open government. So those actions can get expensive, and we try really hard to avoid getting into litigation over open government kind of issues. It is also possible to have a criminal prosecution brought by the district attorney. There has never been a successful criminal prosecution for a violation of the Brown Act. And that's because there are two elements required to prove the crime. One is that an action was taken at a meeting in violation of the Brown Act, and second, that there was intent to deprive the public of information. And usually these things come up, something was discussed at a closed session that shouldn't have been discussed, or something like that. Well, there wasn't an action taken, and the DA really can't prove what the intent of everybody was. So it's possible, and I need to tell you about it, but it's never been successfully prosecuted. As I say, usually the prosecution is a civil case. Conflicts of interest, there are three sources of law: Political Reform Act, which is your essentially conflicts with your financial interests. There are common law conflict of interest rules that are common law means created by a judge, where a judge looked at something and said, there's not a statute that prohibits this, but this was really bad, and I'm going to say it was illegal. It doesn't happen very long, but that's kind of a translation of what common law means. And then there's a government code section called Government Code Section 1090 that prohibits the city from entering into a contract in which any one of you has a financial interest. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. The thing to remember about conflict laws that I think makes it easier to sort of sort out in your own mind is that the law is aimed not just at actual misconduct, but also at the perception of misconduct or temptation. The purpose of the law is to make people feel like there's not a temptation for a decision maker to act in their own interest, or also to just feel like everything was above board. If the public's going to perceive something as being wrong, it's likely going to violate one of these laws, just because the law is aimed at perception as well as actual misconduct. And I know everybody feels like, we have our own sort of moral compass, and we say, I don't need this law, this really restrictive law, to tell me what's right and what's wrong. I can guide my way through in a way that's acting in the public interest, and I can act ethically. The law is saying, yeah, we do need the statute, because what we're trying to avoid is somebody perceiving that you might not be acting ethically. And that, it's a tough concept, but if you think about all these laws in that context, I think they make more sense. The Political Reform Act prohibits public officials from making, participating in making, or influencing a decision in which they have a reason to know that they have a material financial interest. Again, this is one of those laws, it's not just voting, right? You can violate the conflict laws by participating in a discussion of an issue, even if at the end of the discussion you say, I'm going to abstain. If you've participated in the discussion and you have a conflict of interest, you've still violated the conflict of interest laws. That's why now the law says when you have a conflict of interest, you have to get up and leave the dais and go outside the room, so you can't be tempted to participate in the discussion. Also, the law prohibits you from trying to influence a decision in which you have a conflict of interest. So you can't sit and be silent, but kind of roll your eyes at one point or another in the, or gesture or whatever. It also means that if you have a conflict of interest in a matter, you can't call the city manager and say, look, I know I can't vote on this, but let me tell you what I think. That's influencing the making of a decision. You really have to completely abstain from any decision in which you might have a conflict of interest. You all know about the Form 700. Filing deadline's coming up here in a month or so, April 1st. All I can say about Form 700 is that it's really important to report your interests accurately for two reasons. One is that accurate reporting prevents conflicts, gives you kind of a checklist of potential conflicts to look for, also increases public confidence. If they see that decision makers are willing to disclose their financial interests. but also because if the FPPC catches you once failing to accurately report an interest or forgetting to put something on your form, they're almost always going to apply more scrutiny to your future filings. So it's really just worth the time to make sure that each filing every year is correct and accurate. There are other types of disclosure requirements, as you know. As a candidate, you have to report campaign contributions on Form 410, 460. I'll talk about that Levine Act issue in a minute. There's also a requirement for all of you as elected office holders to report what are called behested contributions. And these are contributions to a third party, such as a nonprofit, at your request that equal or exceed $5,000 in a calendar year. So if you're on the committee for the Education Foundation fundraiser and you send out solicitations to various people that you know on kind of your fundraising list, and somebody gives $5,000 or more in a calendar year in response to your request, even though it's not to you, it's at your request, and there's a form, FEPC Form 803, that has to be filed. That's $5,000 in a calendar year, and it's only a single source. So if you help the Education Foundation and you receive a bunch of raise a bunch of contributions that might be cumulatively above 5,000, that this rule doesn't apply. It's a single source that gives $5,000 or more in a calendar year. How do you know if you have a conflict of interest under the Political Reform Act? Question is it reasonably foreseeable that a governmental decision will have a material financial effect on any of your financial interests in a way that's distinguishable from the public generally? Those are the four elements of a conflicts of interest analysis. Is it a governmental decision? It's things like votes, right? Motions, resolutions, ordinance, deliberation on decisions, giving direction on policy, making appointments to office, entering into a contract, or determining not to act. That's a key concern. Sometimes you'll have something presented to you as, a policy decision. Should we explore entering in a contract to do something, and you decide not to? That's still a governmental decision, and you have to look out for your financial interest. Again, it's more than just voting. It's participating in making a decision, and I won't read all this text to you, but it's basically, are you a part of that decision that gets made, or do you attempt to influence that decision that gets made in one or more different ways, but usually behind the scenes? What are the financial interests that are covered by this? It's your real property interest worth at least $2,000. It's your source of income. That could be income from your job, from a consulting contract. It also includes income from nonprofit entities if you're appointed, if you work for a nonprofit. It includes your spouse's or domestic partner's income if you have a community property interest. It includes investments that you might have worth $2,000 or more. That could be stock in a corporation, for example. It includes your business interests. If you're part owner of a business in town that could be affected by city decisions. It includes sources of gifts of $630 or more from a single source over the last 12 months. If somebody's given you a gift that's worth $630 or more in the last year, you would have a conflict. And then there's this catch-all category about personal finances. Basically, if a decision means you're going to have to spend more than $500 as a result of the decision, every business in town has to buy a new sign by a certain time. Or every business in a certain block has to upgrade their signs, and you own one of those businesses, and you're going to spend $500 on the upgrade. That would be covered by this kind of catch-all circumstance. So we look at a four-step test, and this is kind of what was on that slide before. The really important element here is the concept of materiality, which is stuff that's a really small decision or a decision that's involving a really big corporation or a really big landowner that you might have a financial interest in, maybe it's not a really material effect on that interest, and you might not have a conflict of interest. But there's a whole bunch of rules and regulations that determine what's material and what's not. And there's a slide here in a minute that I'm going to give away, which says if we're already talking about materiality with one of your financial interests, you should be talking to us to help you wade through the regulations and determine what's material and what's not. I'll give you an example. AT&T, a lot of people have stock in AT&T or the other big telecom companies. And they might have an investment worth a significant amount of money in one of those telecom companies. And one of those telecom companies comes to the city and they want to rent the roof of the fire station and put up an antenna. Well, at first glance, you'd say, oh, well, I got AT&T stock. AT&T wants this lease. I could have a conflict of interest. Except that there's a rule on materiality that says for a Fortune 500 or a Fortune 100 company, whichever AT&T is, the decision's got to be worth a couple of $1 million for it to be material. And if it's not, then you don't have a conflict of interest. And that's a reason for us to talk about it in advance and try to walk through the regulations, because there are a lot of things that look like they might be conflicts that aren't. There's a lot of things where you would say, oh, this isn't a conflict, and we have to say, no, there's a hard rule. It is a conflict. So it's a collaborative process, and we would always encourage you to consult with our office on conflict issues as much in advance as possible. Bottom line, as I said, if you're considering whether something's material to one of your financial interests, it's time to ask for legal assistance. If you are disqualified, don't discuss with or try to influence staff or your colleagues outside of a meeting even. You're required to identify the nature of your conflict at the meeting. I'm recusing myself. I have a conflict of interest because I own property within 500 feet, something like that. And then you're required to leave the chambers after stating that. The only exception is for items on the consent calendar. If something's on a consent calendar, all you have to do is say, I'm abstaining, I have a conflict on item 6B, and you don't have to leave the room. And the clerk will just record the vote. And this note at the bottom, I have had situations where decision makers have thought they could sort of avoid disclosing the conflict of interest by just taking a walk during the item and not actually saying anything about it. That's not complying with the law. The law says that in order to not be violating, you have to state the nature of the conflict before you leave the room. Just an example of materiality standards. This is the easy one that comes up most often. It's about real property interests. We have direct decisions. If the property is the subject of a general plan amendment or a zoning, or your property interest is requesting like a CUP, for example, that's directly involved in the decision. Indirect decisions are more about changing the character of the neighborhood or the use of property very near to property that you own. And we apply materiality in different ways depending on whether it's a direct effect or an indirect effect. There always used to be a 500-foot rule that, for those of you who have been around a while, basically we said if you're within 500 feet of a decision, you have a property interest, you're out and you have a conflict of interest. Now, as the FPPC often does, they've made it more complicated, and they have this 500, 1,000, and more than 1,000-foot rule that's not as easy to follow as it used to be. Basically, now we say that if a property that's the subject of a decision is within 500 feet of your property, and that's any boundary to any boundary, then it's likely material, you have a conflict of interest, you should recuse yourself. If we're talking about property that's between 500 and 1,000 feet of your property, there's a whole bunch of factors that need to be applied, and that's where you would ask for our help to walk through that. And now, if the property is that's affected by a decision is 1,000 feet or more from your property, there's a rebuttable presumption that there's no conflict of interest. There'd have to be a really unique situation for a piece of property that's 1,000 feet away from you to create a conflict. Exceptions, where it might feel like that's within the 1,000 foot rule, but you still could participate. There's no material financial effect if a decision solely concerns repairs, replacement or maintenance of existing streets, water, sewer, storm drain, or other facilities, because that affects everybody that's in that general neighborhood. There's no material effect if a decision solely concerns general plan policy decisions, unless the decision is initiated by the public official themselves. So broad general plan decisions might not create a conflict, whereas decisions relating to the zoning ordinance or a use permit or something like that frequently would. And then if you happen to live in a condo or common interest development, those interests in the common area of those kind of developments are now excluded from the definition of real property, so we don't worry about conflict of interest analysis for people who own or who live in condo or common interest properties. There's a public generally exception, which says that if a significant segment of the public will be affected in the same manner as the office holder gets to participate because everybody's going to be affected the same way. And then there's this rule called the rule of necessity, and this is really rare, but sometimes a decision will create a situation where a majority of the city council has a conflict of interest. And then we don't have enough people left to participate to make a legal decision because, for example, in this city council, 3 people were recusing themselves. So there's a rule that allows for us to use a random selection process to bring one of the conflicted members back, provided that we explain what we're doing, and we can actually make a quorum and have a decision made. We don't want people to not be able to get a land use permit or some application simply because a majority of the body has a conflict. I advise the city council where 3 members of the city council in a small city all live on the same street and within a couple of blocks of each other. And that street is near the subject of a lot of land use decisions. And we frequently had situations where all 3 members who live on that street can't participate unless we use this rule. There's a conflict of interest created if you're interviewing for a job or you have an offer from a job. You then are precluded from participating in a decision that would affect your future employment, your future employer. This exception does not apply if you're seeking employment with a local, state, or federal governmental entity. It's really a private employer that then has business before the city council, and you have a conflict in that prospective employment. The Levine Act, I know I did a training session here maybe a year ago or so on the provisions of the Levine Act. The good news is that the $250 threshold that I told you about when I was here before is now $500 as of January 1st. So basically, if you have received a contribution of $500 or more, excuse me, in the previous 12 months, you have a conflict of interest involving that donor. In addition, I can grab it, thanks. In addition, once a decision has been made by this body, you are then precluded from soliciting or accepting a contribution of $500 or more from the subject of the decision for 12 months thereafter. So it's basically a 12-month look back and a 12-month look ahead. This all arose from a scandal in the 80s or maybe early 90s involving the Coastal Commission, where members of the Coastal Commission were raising money for the governor and then making decisions on coastal development permits that involved applicants who'd made significant contributions to the governor. So that's where the corruption statute came from. But again, if you have received $500 in contributions in the previous 12 months, you have to keep track of your contributors. You're required to disclose the contribution. If the contributor is a party to the application, they're required to disclose the contribution, and then you are required to recuse yourself from the decision. There is a circumstance where you can quote-unquote cure the violation by returning any part of the contribution that's above $500. It's a really short time window to do it, but it's possible, and we can advise you through that process. So it's not an absolute. If you got 500 and didn't know somebody was coming here for business, it's not an absolute circumstance where they're allowed to kind of preemptively get you out of the decision by not telling you they were coming. There's a way to cure, but it all has to be done very quickly and with very specific rules that we can advise you on. And I just covered all of that, and I covered that. You are allowed, even if you are recused from a decision, to participate in the city council member solely as a member of the public. You have to recuse yourself from your official capacity. You have to leave the room except to come in and participate in a decision as a member of the public, protecting your own interests. It's not a situation where you can have a conflict of interest and have no real personal interest in the decision, but just a strong opinion, where you come in and say, I'm speaking as a member of the public and I'm going to tell you what I think. You really have to be speaking on behalf of your own personal interests. So it's if there's a land use decision that involves a property that you own, you're permitted to come in and tell the city council or ask them for the permit or participate as a member of the public. If somebody's doing something next door that you want to to your property and you want to tell the city council what you think, you're allowed to do that because you have your own personal interest at stake. It's not just a way to sort of avoid the conflict laws and come back in and say what you think, even though you're disqualified. So there's a very narrow exception, but the law recognizes that everybody in a community has their own right to protect their personal interests. Penalty for Political Reform Act violations. The city is interested because city decisions that are taken in violation of the conflict of interest laws can be invalidated. And so that's obviously a situation where the city could have liability. The Political Reform Act violation is a misdemeanor. It's not frequently prosecuted as one, but it could be. Most often the FPPC has an administrative enforcement mechanism, and this is true for campaign contributions as well, where the fines there are $5,000 to $10,000 per violation, and those are personal liability fines. They are not fines that the city is able to pay on your behalf. You are able to get help, again, because the city has an interest. We are always available to help you with these issues. If you'd rather not go through us, you can call that number and talk to the FPPC about it. And there's also a situation where if we act before anything happens, we can request formal advice from the FPPC. And if nothing has happened and they send the advice and you follow the advice, you then cannot be prosecuted for a violation of the conflict laws. My motto always is, if in doubt, sit it out, because the stakes are personal and they're just too high. Common law conflicts I already told you about, which is basically where it's just the circumstances are so bad that a judge thinks there had to be some problem. Doesn't happen very often, and to save time I won't bore you with the details. Government Code Section 1090 is really important for anybody who has a business. Basically, the city cannot do business through a contract with a member of its city council or with the city manager or with the city attorney, with anybody. We can't enter into contracts for what I call side hustles. The most common example I give you is a situation I had a few years ago where a city council member had a catering business and submitted a bid through an RFP process to do catering for the city. And the city awarded the contract to the council member's business, thinking it was all on the up and up because it was going through an open process. And that contract was after about a year was invalidated by a court because the city council member had an interest in that contract with the city because it was with his side business. It turned out that the council member had to pay back everything that had been paid to him over the course of that year, even though the services had been provided. So it's a really kind of draconian rule. Public Records Act affords any person the right to inspect and be provided a copy of any identifiable public record. And public record is like really, really broadly defined. You'll be happy to know that a couple of years ago, the state legislature amended the definition of person to specifically include elected members of local agencies. Before that, I guess you all weren't persons. And that arose out of a situation in another city where a council member was, sort of on the wrong end of a 3-2 fight and started making Public Records Act requests, and the city manager directed the staff to not fulfill those Public Records Act requests because the definition of the person who could make the request did not include city council members, and so the legislature felt it necessary, after a judge corrected that misimpression, the legislature included you all as persons, so you have that going for you. Public record is any writing with information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, or retained by a state or local agency, regardless of physical form or characteristics. So it's both hard copy, photographs, digital, that all of those different kind of physical characteristics, but it has to be relating to the conduct of the public's business. The city manager's personal checkbook in his desk drawer is not a public record because it doesn't relate to the conduct of the public's business. The check register for the city and the finance department obviously is a public record. Writing can include handwritten, printed documents, photos, videos, voicemails, drawings, plans, and maps, and I think most significantly for elected officials, the term writing includes emails, text messages, tweets, social media posts, anything in digital form. So cities frequently get requests for all emails between Councilmember A and Developer B over a course of some period of time, or all text messages between council members during a particular period of time, or between a council member and the city manager. All of those things are very common Public Records Act requests now, and we have to ask you for those because of a case out of the city of San Jose that said that these text messages, emails about city business, et cetera, are public records, even if they are made using a personal account. So, now we'll get a request for emails and text messages, and we'll ask you if you have any saved on your personal account as well as your city account, because the California Supreme Court has said if you do business on your personal account, it could be considered a public record. Now, personal business on your personal account is not a public record. So we always recommend, if you have city email accounts, city phone, those kinds of things, it's much better to keep your personal and your political stuff separate, personal and government stuff separate. It's also best to keep personal communications out of government communications. We all know we get into these email threads where we talk about scheduling a meeting or something is going on. We're going to sign this contract. And then we get down to about 12 emails down, and it's, hey, what are you doing for dinner Friday night? Why don't we go have a drink before? We're going here. Who do we invite? I mean, there's the personal thing, and then we go back, okay, so you're going to send me that contract by the end of the week, right? Well, if somebody asks for emails about that contract, we have to turn over the whole chain. We don't get to delete stuff that's not necessarily relevant, and so we really, just as a best practice, advise staff especially to separate personal communications from business communications, so we don't have that problem. Basically, if you don't want to see it up on a screen like this in a courtroom, don't tack it on to an official email. There are exemptions, stuff we don't turn over. This is a list. I won't read it all, but basically our employees' personnel records, it's important to note, are confidential and don't get disclosed in Public Records Act requests, as well as personal information like social security numbers, home address and telephone number of our employees. However, salary information is subject to disclosure. That's again based on a case. So if somebody makes a request for the salary ranges or what every employee makes, we're required to disclose that information. And finally, want to talk just about fair process for a minute. And we already talked about common law conflicts and campaign contributions. I just wanted to let you know with regard to qualifications for office, obviously the municipal code and the government code list what the qualifications for holding office as a city council member or the mayor are. Those qualifications are usually registered voter status, residency, in this case, residency in a certain voting district. Those qualifications have to be met throughout your term of office. So if you're a resident when you're elected in the district you represent, you're required to maintain permanent residency in that district throughout your term of office in order to stay in office. There's also a law that says that you can't take on, once you hold public office, you can't take on what's called an incompatible office, which is basically another office where you would have kind of a conflict of loyalties. The easiest example is if you got elected to the city council and you all of a sudden became aware of a vacancy on the school board, you can't take office on the school board and keep your city council office. Planning commissioners aren't allowed to run for office for the school district or the water district, those kinds of things, because there's too much interaction between the jobs. And the reason it's really important to be aware of is that the law is that once you take an incompatible office, you lose the first office automatically. So if you take that second office, it's incompatible, you're automatically disqualified from the first office. And I find a lot of times people don't understand that there is this doctrine of incompatible office. And so by the time they've done something and said, hey, was that okay? The answer is no. It's not okay because the rule is you lose the first office. I had a city council member who got appointed to the board of trustees to the local community college district. And she thought, well, the community college is not even located in the city. There's no interaction. It'd be fine. And didn't know that this rule was out there and was disqualified as a member of the city council because once she was sworn in as a member of the community college board. You do know that there are competitive bidding laws that apply to the city. Especially in public works, we give award contract to the lowest responsible bidder. I'm not going to go into those rules because they're really staff-driven rules. I just want to make you aware of what's there. The last thing I just want to talk about is the concept of due process, because I find that people assume that federal constitutional issues are really things that happen in the federal government and things that are maybe sometimes are worried about at the federal level and sometimes not worried about at the federal level. But I think you should know that the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is what we refer to as the Due Process Clause, is more often in play in local government than in any other level of government. Virtually every week or every month at this city, we have to think about a person's due process rights. And we have to make sure that we're protecting the rights afforded by the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. And you might not think about it in the constitutional context, but when we look at stuff like land use entitlements and the notice and hearing requirements that apply to, for example, a conditional use permit, well, the reason we go through all that rigmarole about noticing people within 300 feet and making sure the applicant gets notice of the hearing and that they're here to speak for themselves is because they have due process rights at stake and we're protecting their Fifth Amendment rights. Same thing applies to license revocations or revoking a conditional use permit or placing additional conditions on a business, areas where people have property rights at stake. The Fifth Amendment really controls what rights have to be protected. Employee discipline and termination is a key area where we have to follow all the statutory processes because employees have a right to public employment until it's taken away properly through the appropriate process. So there's a lot of stuff that feels like just kind of, God, it's just a grind. Why do we have to do this? Well, it's because we're complying with the Fifth Amendment and we're making sure that we protect people's due process rights. Those things are also implicated when we're talking about adopting ordinances or internal policies, policy kind of decisions, but to a different degree, where the rule affects a whole bunch of people as opposed to just one person. The due process considerations are a little bit different. But basically what due process means, and the thing I'd really like you to take away from this part of the discussion is before government may constitutionally take an action that affects a protected interest, the holder of that interest is entitled to reasonable notice, a reasonable opportunity to be heard, and an impartial decision maker. Now, the first two are really the responsibility of the people who are sitting at this table. Notice and providing somebody a spot on the agenda at the time that they can be heard is really a staff function. We make sure that the notice gets posted and mailed in a timely manner. We make sure that we give them their opportunity for a hearing within the rules and that it appears on an agenda. The impartial decision maker is entirely up to you folks. They have the right to have a hearing before somebody who's not just impossibly biased either for them or against them. They have a right to an open mind from the decision maker. Now, that right is a little bit different, as I said before, whether we're talking about legislative decisions like adopting an ordinance, adopting a general plan or a specific plan, approving stuff that applies looking forward to a whole group of people, versus quasi-judicial decisions where you all are sitting here as a judge to determine whether or not they have met the standard to get a variance, or if they've met the standard to get a conditional use permit, or somebody who has appealed a personnel decision, whether or not the discipline that was imposed in that personnel decision is justified. In the quasi-judicial setting, you have no ability to apply your own opinions and must make a decision based entirely on the evidence that's presented to you. In the legislative decision area, you do have a right to apply your own opinions because you were all elected because you think something about what's good for the city of Solvang. So when you're making rules that apply looking forward and are going to apply to a lot of different people, you have the right to come in with your own opinions about public issues. Indeed, your constituents expect you to have policy positions on important issues. When you're talking about the kind of decision that's on the right-hand column, my right-hand column, the quasi-judicial column, you're acting as a judge and you apply the law to the facts as you hear them within the public hearing. So it's important to know what kind of decision you're talking about. Reasonable opportunity, just FYI, means that we have to give people a reasonable amount of time. That's why we have a kind of time limit on public hearings. We invite folks to submit their comments in writing. But most importantly, in that quasi-judicial setting where there's an applicant, we allow that applicant a rebuttal to everything is said, right? You'll probably experience where the applicant gives a presentation. They sit down, people get up and say, I'm for this, I'm against this. The applicant has a right to respond to negative comments that are made during the hearing. They get the right to correct the record or give their response, because otherwise, if they spoke first, anybody could stand up and just lie, and their rights would be affected because they didn't have a chance to respond to what was being said. The hearing creates what's called the record. Sometimes you hear people say, I want to put this in the record. When we have a hearing, that hearing is creating, quote unquote, the record. There's almost always kind of a script for a public hearing, and you're helping to protect people's due process rights by following the script and not jumping around, and especially not saying what you think about a particular application before the public hearing is completed. A lot of times I will see, not a lot, but sometimes I will see council members who are just really eager to say what they think, and they don't wait to hear from the public in the public hearing before they say, I'm really against this project, I gotta say it's too high and whatever. Well, that's violating the applicant's due process rights because you haven't heard the evidence yet before making up your mind. So we really ask you to, at that point in the hearing where the mayor says, are there any questions? We really ask you to limit that to questions and not statements of opinion. Sometimes people are tempted to kind of get off the mark and offer their opinion. We give you two times to speak, when you ask questions and then when you deliberate at the end, and the deliberation is the part at which you should say what you think about the application. And then the rule on ex parte communications, substance of the hearing cannot occur outside of the hearing. So if there's a public hearing, the evidence has to be presented at the public hearing so that everybody gets a chance to hear it, the applicant gets a chance to hear it. There are those situations where you make a site visit, right? You meet the applicant or you go look at the story poles that are erected on the site or whatever. If you do that by yourself, that's okay. But come back and at the public hearing say, hey, I visited the property. Here's what I saw. Or I met with the applicant, here's what they told me. Or I met with the neighbor, here's what they told me. That evidence is shared in the public hearing, so everybody has the same information, everybody makes the decision based on the same information, and it's fair to the applicant. Obviously, we'd rather, in most cases, that you not do that, because it's just easier to keep the record and keep everybody on the same page, but we know that council members do it, and this is the way to get that information in the record. But really, you know, what we're trying to avoid is any exhibition of disqualifying bias. We really cannot have a situation where, in the quasi-judicial context, decision makers have a specific bias against an applicant or bias against an opponent, anybody who's affected by the decision. And it really has to be specific as to the applicant, specific as to the neighbor, and not just sort of a general feeling about issues related to the application. An example I would give is if council members have made public statements, a council member has made public statements that have said, I hate big box stores, especially hardware stores, and I will never vote for a Home Depot in this town. If Home Depot ever comes, I'm voting against it, right? I've had that situation. That's different from a council member who's out and saying, you know, I want to do everything I can do to help small business. I think small business is better than big business. That's a policy statement, whereas the other one showed a specific prejudice against a particular applicant. And in the Home Depot example, if Home Depot came in here, they would have grounds to ask that that council member be disqualified because that council member has made a statement that shows specific prejudice against the applicant. And what we're talking about is prejudice that's sufficient to impair the decision maker's ability to decide the matter, right? It's really got to be a pretty specific showing of bias on the part of the decision maker, but when it happens, it always results in us advising the decision maker to disqualify themselves because the city has a really high liability risk because we're talking about U.S. constitutional rights here. There's a case called Fairfield versus Superior Court, which says that campaign statements do not disqualify a council member from voting. What you say out on the campaign trail does not necessarily disqualify you from voting on an item once you get elected, except when you do that I hate Home Depot kind of a comment, right? That's sort of the limit to this rule. The courts expect you as local elected officials to express your views to your constituents on issues of policy and public controversy. My favorite line from this case is the court said that we do not expect public officials to be intellectual eunuchs. which I thought was a great line. Tips for decision makers, finally, if you think you can't be fair, if you think there's any reason that your impartiality is going to be questioned, don't participate. The stakes for the city are too high. Avoid statements, as I said, before the hearing closes that suggest you've already made up your mind, and really behave judiciously. How would you want to be treated by a decision maker if you were standing at the podium as the applicant, and really think about avoiding the appearance of bias. We talked about the site visit and off-the-record comment, and I just want to really leave you with that concept of policy positions versus specific bias against particular applicants. That's probably the highest risk of conduct that a council member can engage in terms of risk to the city, is being really specifically biased against a particular applicant or a particular project. So I'd really encourage you to think about that. I know that's not really been an issue that when I've been around in Solvang, but sometimes issues get really emotional, especially big development issues, and we want to avoid that bias claim. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Craig. Does anybody have any questions?
At the last meeting, we had an item on the consent agenda. Took it out of the consent agenda and discussed it, and was called on a point of order, which you corrected. Define for me what are the rules about what goes into a consent agenda. I mean, why don't we just put everything in a consent agenda and then there's no back and forth?
Excuse me, a consent agenda, just for those who aren't aware, is a administrative convenience by which the council can act on a number of different items, usually relatively routine items, with one vote.
Right.
That's the consent. We call it the consent calendar. I think the speaker at the time called it a consent agenda. And their argument at the last meeting was, well, it's a consent agenda. You've taken it off the consent agenda, therefore it's not on the agenda.
Yeah.
You can't act on it, which wasn't true. The rule is really the only thing that cannot appear on a consent calendar is a public hearing item. Anything that requires a public hearing, you're required to go through that procedural step first. Theoretically, all kinds of decisions that don't show up on there now could be on there. The problem is those don't get separate discussion.
Right.
And staff, I think, makes a judgment as to items that really are either policy items that the council should discuss, items where staff doesn't have a particular recommendation. It's really those items that are kind of the meat of an agenda, and the consent calendar involves contracts that are getting renewed and adopting your minutes and that routine kind of stuff.
And we use those, our city manager puts them on the consent agenda. We call it a consent agenda. And it's normally, like you said, it's just easy stuff. I shouldn't say easy. It is clerical almost.
Right.
It's approval of the draft and things like that. There's usually a couple little contract adjustment issues, and we handled that. But I was just curious about the rules about what goes into a consent agenda.
Yeah, there's not really rules that say these following things can appear on a consent agenda. Really, it's more the stuff that cannot. And essentially, that's a public hearing item. Because you got to hold a public hearing, obviously you can't have it on a consent agenda. But I think mostly it's a matter of practice. Randy, I'm sure wants to chime in, but mostly it's a matter of practice where staff feels like they know enough that they can just make a recommendation and the council is generally going to follow it.
Yeah, I use as a guideline basically a non-controversial item, or at least something that's been before council. I mean, in an instance last week, I think what the issue was that the individuals who spoke up on a point of order felt that because it had been pulled from the consent agenda, it was going to the regular agenda, which would then allow them to comment again. And they actually had the opportunity to comment as an item on the consent calendar, and they all did.
Yes.
So we weren't denying them the right to do anything. It was just they wanted, at least my impression of what was going on was that they wanted the opportunity to comment on the matter again.
Well, we couldn't do that because we didn't announce it as being a public hearing, if I'm not mistaken. So if it's on the consent agenda, you can talk to it, but we don't respond to it like we do in a public hearing.
Right.
And we did not announce that. So even though we pulled it from the consent agenda, it wasn't a public hearing.
That's
So
correct.
at that point in time, it was not a point of order.
And there are other, I think the other side of that is that there are probably folks who looked at the agenda and said, consent item, I'm not going down because there's not going to be any discussion.
Right.
And to protect those people, that's the delineation. If it gets pulled off the consent agenda, then somebody might say, well, I would have come down if I would have known. So it really has got to be kind of a limited circumstance where, in most cases, it's relatively non-controversial routine items.
Another question, if I may. You talk about emails and saved and whatnot. I delete most of my emails now. I don't think that takes it off of our servers. But I delete my personal emails, and I delete them permanently. As much as you can do anything permanently on the internet these days. But I can't retrieve them. So if that's the case, then the FOIA information from me would not be available because I've deleted it.
Yeah, one element of the definition of a record that I put up on the screen is that the record has to be retained in the ordinary course of business. And with emails, some cities have an automatic deletion policy. Some cities have, instructions to staff and officials to delete at certain times. Other people just follow their own processes. But our position is, once an email is deleted, that's, even if it's still out in the Ethernet somewhere, the cloud, or on a server, that email has been deleted. It's showing that the record is not being retained by the agency in the ordinary course of business. It's not a public record. Now, we've been in litigation
Interesting.
where the discovery rules are different, and theoretically somebody could hire a forensic specialist to come in and get a court order to go through your server and find all that deleted stuff. That's litigation, that's through a subpoena, that's completely different than the Public Records Act. Our position is that once something has been deleted, it is no longer being retained in the ordinary course of business, which seems, fairly easy for everybody to understand.
Deleted by me or deleted by staff?
Either.
Either. That's
I
interesting.
think Anne Marie's heart skipped a beat when you said you delete emails. So I just to clarify, we do have on the city's email system, we have a program called Barracuda that allows the retrieval of emails even if you've deleted them by searching certain parameters. Cities adopted a retention schedule since I've been here, so sometime in the last couple of years, and most things are 2 years. I would strongly recommend, due to the nature of our retention schedule, that if you are engaging in city business on your personal email, that you don't do that and that you do it on the city's website or on the city's email system. So if you're deleting emails and you're talking about going to, it's hard for me to say this, a Dodgers game with a friend, and you delete that, that's not something that has anything to do with the city. So, but if it is a city issue, you got an email from somebody that knows your personal email address, and they said, I think you should vote for or against this item. Those things you should retain or at least create a record so that it can be accessed at some point in the future.
Well, I recall a FOIA that came in and said, any contact you've had with this other person. So if I called the previous mayor and said, you want to go play golf, that's contact with that person, and I'm supposed to turn that over?
Again, the definition is relating to the conduct of city business, and that email is just a social invitation, doesn't relate to the conduct of city
Okay.
business.
See, I thought everything was, I had to turn everything in, so I think I did. Anne Marie got all my junk.
Emery's probably not happy with my position on these things, but that's the way we look at it. Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm not trying to argue with anybody or,
No. As you said, we've adopted a policy, but part of that process of a policy is to impart the information, and that regardless of what it is, a text message, an email, or whatever, there is a retention schedule for that type of document or type of communication within the scope of the work of the city. So again, if it's your golf game, no one cares. If it's about you meeting with someone else to discuss the corner walk and don't walk, you should be retaining that. And 2 years is the minimum on correspondence, which is what that would fall under. But the retention would change on that communication to the underlying subject matter if that continued another path. So let's say it's about a general plan amendment, and we don't have that on the radar, but it comes up in a year, and then it's something that's going on for years. The retention of that communication regarding that particular subject matter will now fall under the retention of that particular subject matter. So it's no longer merely correspondence that you can just get rid of at the end of 2 years because it's 2 years and it's correspondence, but it then gets looped into whatever subject matter that is. And so the retention may even be much longer. It might be a communication about a settlement or anything like that. So again, we have different retention schedule, or we have a retention schedule that identifies the type of documents that might be kept permanently, or for a decade, or for 5 years, or for 2 years, or until no longer needed. You really have to look at the subject matter before you determine the disposition of that particular record.
but, which again is really another reason not to do city business on personal accounts. And that's, yeah, I'm for the general good, it's a really good idea to just avoid city business on personal accounts altogether.
Questions? Comments? I just want a couple of comments, and thank you, Craig, it was well done. It reminds me of a number of cliches, predominantly, no good deed goes unpunished, but as a council, we have a higher duty, higher responsibility than the general public, and it requires all of us to be above reproach in all our actions. So, and when you were mentioning serial meetings, it made me think that we couldn't have Kellogg's, or something like that, So, at any rate, thank you again. We'll move on to the next item if there's no other questions. City manager report, please.
Yes, thank you. I had a few things I wanted to report. You may have noticed at Solvang Park, an orange fence around there. We are in the process of replacing the turf. As I think anybody who was here during the month of December recognized, we had quite a few visitors. The lawn was trashed. I know we are looking through the recreation master plan update, doing some additional work and maybe making some other areas that are more conducive to heavy foot traffic, but it was in a serious state of disrepair, and because that recreation master plan will probably take the better part of a year, possibly a little bit longer to actually implement, it wasn't that expensive, and we decided to go ahead and replace that. I know there was at least one of our residents was concerned about it, but for purposes of sharing with everyone, it's it'll be at least a year before we're able to do anything there. So we felt it was important to get that in better shape. Also wanted to announce our county's Office of Emergency Management has announced, and you may have seen it in other forums, but there is an AM radio station focused on disaster preparedness and emergency information launched in Mid and North South Santa Barbara County. They will be broadcasting on AM 530 in English and Spanish. So that is good news for the inevitable disaster. Unfortunately, we don't want one, but it's not a matter of if, but when. There will be a community discussion on homelessness here in City Hall, council chambers on March 12th. So about 3 weeks from now, that's a Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. We're going to be talking about with Supervisor Joan Hartman and the city and the various other leaders to explore effective solutions for homelessness, available resources, and ways to help the unhoused residents achieve health and independence. So we're not, it's about educating the community about all the services that are available to the homeless community now through the county, because some of our more hardcore service-resistant folks have a support network, and we're not convincing them to go into the system. So to help people understand that, we're looking to help. Again, it's an educational forum. Major U Committee will meet here on Tuesday, March 25th, so a little more than a month from now, at 3 p.m. That's the next scheduled meeting for them. We had one mandatory grant meeting last week. The second and final one will be Tuesday, March 11th at 3 p.m. here in the council chambers. Reminding everyone, if you do not attend one of these two meetings, that they will not be eligible to receive a grant from the city this year. That's one of the things we're changing, trying to streamline the process and eliminate the babysitting that's become necessary by some of the city staff to help people get free money. So also the DRC and the Planning Commission will have a joint workshop also on, I guess it's on March 13th, starting at 6 p.m.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity to help educate each body about and getting direction on signs, education, and objective standards, as these will be used for vetting new projects going forward. So it's kind of a outcome of the council's direction when we adopted the new zoning ordinance, and it's again scheduled for March 13th at 6 p.m. And lastly, I wanted to announce that we're having another fire meeting, fire awareness, I guess, mitigation meeting in conjunction with the county to be more for the valley. We had one for the city here a couple weeks ago, and we're going to do another one that will be part of the whole valley. That will happen on Monday, March 31st at 5:30 p.m. at the Veterans Hall. So because we're expecting a larger crowd, we're going to do it there. And for those that tried to observe the meeting that we had here, and we broadcasted on where there were some audio problems, and those audio problems have been corrected. So there are some interruptions, but most of it is available now. And that's all I have.
Thank you. Any questions?
One quick one. Your AM 5:30 emergency info, how are we getting that out to the public?
We have shared that on our website. We've shared it on our Facebook, and the county has done as well.
Thank you.
Okay, that will bring us, thank you, Mr. Murphy. That'll bring us to item 5 for report outs and communications by council and comments. Why don't we start with Ms. Smith?
I just wanted to say that I attended the Solvang Chamber mixer at the Cottage Primary Care on Alamo Pintado, and that was February 13th, a Thursday. It was a fun event, and a lot of people were there. And I didn't realize that that Cottage had like the entire building. Like it was much more expansive than what I thought it was. So it was really nice to tour that. So it was great, and I just want to do a real thank you to Tracy Beard and her team at the Solvang Chamber, and also to the staff of the Cottage staff. So it was a really nice event. And I just want to say a congratulations, if this is appropriate, to Aaron Peterson for his staff at Chomp for being featured on America's Best Restaurants. I thought that was amazing. Really fun to watch that. So kudos to Aaron, his staff, and I thought it was it's great for the city of Solvang. So just wanted to say that and thank you. I don't know if I'm allowed to say anything about a future event that's coming up. So we're coming up with International Women's Day celebration, which is in March. So there is a big weekend coming up on March like 6th, 7th, and 8th with women winemakers and culinarians. So there's some fun activities that are going on, some grand tastings and food and brunches and all of that. So I just wanted to sort of say something. The grand tasting and culinary event is going to be at 27 Vines, which is on Refugio Road, on Saturday. Is that Saturday the 8th? And there's a brunch being held at Vega Vineyards on the Sunday the 9th. So those are the two events that I know of for that event, but just wanted to let everybody know about that. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to let everybody know that in a little over a week, I will be attending the WELL conference. This is the Water Education for Latino Leaders. This is a conference held by people that work in waterworks as well, with elected officials to educate us about the water crisis in California. So I look very much forward to attending that.
And pray for rain, right? Mark, did you have any?
It's pray for rain, but plan for drought.
Well, I had a couple things on my notes here. I wanted to, first of all, thank Wendy for her vetting the charitable grants and vetting the people that are making those requests, and the efforts you're making for that, and that they all qualify accordingly. Thank you. Saves a lot of time once they get into the system. I want to congratulate Olivia for the regional fire meeting and the prep she's done coming up for the March 31 meeting at the Vets Hall. That'll be a regional wide, and I think Supervisor Hartman will MC that. And then it's already been discussed, but welcome Bridget Paris to our team, the new Public Works Department head. And couple things. On the 14th, my Valentine's Day, I attended a housing and homelessness forum for elected leaders for the Santa Barbara County. And there's a home-friendly designation that the city of Santa Barbara is going for. It's got a lot of, how should I say, a lot of paperwork to go through, if you will. So I asked them to keep us in mind if they were successful, but we didn't have the staff or the manpower to go forward on our own. But we would copy the spinning wheel if it works. And it was really going to be quite the effort, Herculean effort to move that needle. So I says we'll be happy to copy that. Also attended on the 28th the SCAG meeting, SB SCAG, not just a meeting but also orientation for the newer members. As they finish up their endeavors for the 101 in South County, we hope that will generate or free up some additional capital for roads and infrastructure here in this part of the county. And the city of Guadalupe is in the process of transferring its transit program to the city of Santa Maria as a provider. And I I want to watch that closely because if it makes sense, it might be something that we might want to follow as well. It seems like while our transit operations works well, it's a major distraction for, and not really in our wheelhouse for our staff and the specialties that we have. So it might be prudent to have that as discussion in the near future. And then the only other thing I had regarding I'm sorry if I digress a little bit, but when there's a council requested agenda item on here, would you please have a target date put on there? Right now, there's no dates of any meetings or anything else. I'd like to see, so I know something's either being accomplished or postponed or what have you, but that's be a request. And that's all I had for items 5. Okay, now we're at the item 6, consent calendar. Madam Clerk, would you read that for us, please?
Consent is for routine administrative city matters and is approved with one motion. These items are discussed only on request of council members. Members of the public were afforded an opportunity to speak during the public communications portion of this agenda.
Thank you. Any concerns? I'd like to move that we approve items A, B, C, D, and F. I'd like to pull item E, and quite honestly, it's just for my own edification, if you will. It is a budget adjustment of almost $250,000, and I think that justifies pulling it from consent.
I'll second it.
Any discussion? Roll call, please.
Councilmember Infante,
Yes.
Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Elizabeth Arona, absent. Mayor Pro Tem Claudia Arona,
Yes.
Mayor Brown.
Yes.
Motion passes 4-0.
Thank you. Can we have a staff information on this contract, please? Item 6E.
Yes. All right. So it was originally determined that the janitorial cost would be $307,000, $358 per year, and back in December, through December of 2025, the original contract was approved by council on December of 2023. And because those costs were so significant, I did a breakdown of the last 6 months because we were so way over budget. And the biggest contributors to that overage is the trash for $79,170 and the restroom cleanings of $175,240 for Yule Fest. I wasn't part of the original calculation. Prior staff determined those amounts based on the cost spreadsheet that Extreme Clean supplied. We do have them do the vets cleaning on the weekends when there's functions in the vets hall on the weekend, and Sunny Fields cleaning the restrooms and closing the park on the weekends when we don't have staff. We haven't hired staff to do that, so we have staff Monday through Friday, so we have Extreme Clean do that as well. One of the big things is moving forward for next year for Yule Fest. So we have to calculate out how much we're actually going, how much we're going to estimate. We're going to need more restrooms. And the contract actually goes through December. We're asking council to approve an extension through June 30th to align with the budget cycle.
Okay. Do you have a comment or addition?
Well, the only comment I was going to make is historically, we've utilized our public works crews to do the restroom cleaning and a lot of the work that Extreme Clean is now doing. And the effort was to get public works doing more of what public works crews typically do, which are related to street and road maintenance, crosswalks, painting, and those kinds of things. So we knew we were going to have to hire. It was less expensive to utilize the janitorial service to do the work as opposed to hiring public works people, contractors and things to do this. So that's the decision we made. We had 750,000 visitors here during the Yule Fest period this last year. It's a conservative estimate, understanding that the tracking that is done does not track children and it does not track international visitors. So, and you heard Sue from the Visitors Center comment a couple of meetings ago that this was the first Yule Fest that they've not had any complaints about the cleanliness of our restrooms or our trash cans. So entertaining that many people comes at a cost. It's unfortunate. And again, a big chunk of this is because we're extending it an additional 6 months as opposed to just through the end of the calendar year, which would allow, like Wendy pointed out, consistency with the end of the fiscal year. And we would also not be trying to negotiate and change vendors in the middle of a holiday period, which is what happened last year, and it wasn't pretty.
Right.
And also, just for Yule Fest alone, it was $76,000 for Extreme Team to come out. And one thing, too, that staff noticed is they didn't charge us for, they would go through and pick up the trash that was left in the parks, not just dump the trash cans. And they didn't charge us for that. So there was a lot of extra things that they did that wasn't documented because they didn't bill us. So,
I have no question that they're doing
Yeah.
a great job.
No, I know.
That's not my concern.
Yeah.
My concern was really the adjustments, and then also to make sure this is still competitive to previous bids that we might have had with the changes that occurred. So are we still, being fair to those that didn't get the bid by virtue of these modifications?
I wasn't involved in the bidding process with that. Can you?
Well, I was going to say it was broken down on a part of it bid was based on a per unit cost. So in other words, how much will you charge to do this specific task? And so the estimates were made at the time by the former public works director to how many times do they need to empty the trash? How many times do they need to clean the restrooms? And I don't know about you, but anytime I was downtown during that period of time, I saw the yellow flashing light on the truck, and they were out there. I mean, they were cleaning. I think Roger estimated they would clean their bathrooms like 5 times a day, and they were cleaning like, I think I saw at least some weeks it was like almost triple that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, they did a lot more work, but on a per unit basis, yes, it is consistent with what was bid.
And we're, like I said, I thought they did a great job of the services. I just want to make sure, and also, please, in the future, I think, when it is an item of this magnitude, it probably should be on the agenda as opposed to consent. Maybe my colleagues don't agree with that, but even though it's fairly routine, but I just wanted to make sure that there was no improprieties and make sure it was done the way it should be. But I think they're doing a good job, and as long as it's competitive.
Well, I think that one of the things I'm hearing is that this is just an extension to an existing contract to get us in line with our annual budget, for one thing. So it's not necessarily needs to go out for a competitive bid for this last little chunk. And since they are doing a good job, I have no
Right.
qualms about that at all, and would even make a motion that we approve this item.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
We also need a motion to approve the budget adjustment of $215,422.
I thought that was part of it. My apologies. I'll adjust my motion to approve this item with the budget adjustment of the, wherever it went, $215,000.
$1,422.
She gets right down to the penny, you know. It's just,
Do you wish to?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded to accept item 6E on our agenda. And roll call, please.
Councilmember Infante.
yes.
Councilmember Smith.
Yes.
Councilmember Elizabeth Arona, absent. Mayor Pro Tem Claudia Arona.
Yes.
Mayor Brown.
Yes,
Motion passes 4-0.
thank you. Oh, Mr. Murphy.
On one of the consent items, the update on the council goals, I just wanted to point out for the benefit of an individual who's here in the audience who called me earlier today. There is a mention of Lot 72 in there on item 17, which is not one of the current goals. There was some conversation about it at the last time when we considered this, and we will be taking this matter back to council when we update the goals in the future. But there was some concern because it's talking about basically looking at Lot 72 for additional housing or solving some of our housing issues, and there is no staff effort being devoted to that at this time. And again, the council direction before was it's going to come off of there, but purposes, I just want to make that clarification for those who may be concerned.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, there are no public hearings tonight, so we'll go to our discussion item 8A. Would you read that into the record, please?
Discussion and possible action for the mayor to appoint 2 city council members to the ad hoc budget committee.
Thank you. It's an appointment endeavor. Any comments by staff?
Other than last year, we had the mayor and one other city council member. And to streamline the budgeting process, we have also selected tentative dates of April 17th, April 21st, and May 7th to hold the budget meetings. And then staff is hoping to hold a public hearing for the budget on May 27th and then present the draft final budget, the first meeting in June 9th, and seek final adoption on June 23rd. So if you're interested in sitting on the ad hoc committee, which is it's not a Brown Act committee, so it doesn't have to be agendized. However, we hope that you can make those meetings because, and if you can't, let us know right away so we can, who's ever on the committee, so we can look at the schedule and pre-select the dates.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Murphy.
I just wanted to share that I had a conversation with our absent council member on Friday, and she indicated a willingness to serve on the committee if nobody else was able to.
Okay.
She served on it the previous time, right?
No, it was
No?
Dave and Mark
Yeah. But
the last time.
the last time, right?
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know Robert was also there, wasn't he?
That was on the charity thing.
Oh, he was strictly on the grants.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, it was you and I on the budget.
Budget.
Okay, so Elizabeth's not here, so we can,
Well, I was going to say
It's nice of her to.
she volunteered
Yeah,
if
no,
it was in the interest of the rest of the council.
Is there anyone else that's enthusiastic about doing this or has an issue with those dates?
I'm totally enthusiastic, so, and I love those dates, so, but I mean, whatever's going to work best, so. But
Well,
if,
it's an ad hoc
Louise.
committee, so it's not, you're helping give direction, and you're, as my dad would say, if you watch the pennies, the dollars take care of themselves, okay? So we're asking you to look at the pennies and help give direction with regards to a fiscal balanced, even a surplus budget would be just fine.
well, I'm still interested, but if Elizabeth wants to.
So
I need two people.
We need to.
oh,
Well, Louise
then
and
I-
Elizabeth.
I'm on board.
It's supposed to be the mayor and one other.
Oh, does the mayor need to be on that as well?
Okay. Okay, mayor appoints, okay.
So
I
it can't-
I
Perfect.
still appoint Elizabeth Arona and Louise Smith
Perfect.
for that endeavor.
And Louise, just so you know,
Do I need a motion?
we will be reviewing the grant funding applicants. That's a big part of the very first meeting, because we can't really move forward with the budget numbers until we have an estimated grant funding selection.
Well, and the deadlines are very tight here because we don't have any wiggle room between when we get the final draft and the time we have to vote. So, is that correct?
You do have lots of time. Last year, part of the problem was the Measure U committee and scheduling meetings with them, and then coming back to the budget committee, then going back to the Measure U, and then bringing it to council. That didn't work well.
Well, they have
So
a
we're-
meeting scheduled for the 31st of May, or 30th of May.
25th of
20
March
March.
is
Yeah.
their next meeting, but they've given direction based on the meeting we just had a few weeks ago. They now have a list of priorities essentially that we can use to help guide the decisions related to the budget.
Okay. So you feel comfortable with their information?
Yes.
Very well. I don't see anything else on the agenda. Anybody have any closing comments? None? Well, that was, I need that Staples button. That was easy. That being said, we'll be adjourned at 8:37. Thank you.